I'm Frank Avon, the director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center of Global Affairs at SAIS Johns Hopkins. On November 22nd, 2011, the New York Times published a short Errol Morris op doc, Umbrella Man, to mark the 48th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. In the 6.5-minute video, Morris employs his Interontion camera to create his trademark intimacy while interviewing Hosea Tink Thompson, the author of a book on the famous Zapruder film entitled 6 Seconds in Dallas. Backed by a haunting score arranged by the minimalist composer Arvo Part and spliced with snippets of video from the fateful day, Thompson tells the mysterious story of a shadowy figure called the Umbrella Man. Who was the Umbrella Man? During the Zapruder film and other films and photographs from that fateful day in Dallas, an upright figure can be seen standing on the so-called grassy knoll, holding an open black umbrella, moments before the assassin's bullets are fired into the president's motorcade. The image is arresting. The weather in Dallas was sunny and warm. The sight of a lone man under an umbrella would have been disconcerting even if Kennedy's murder had not taken place right in front of the man seconds later. As Thompson says, quote, "In all of Dallas, there appears to be exactly one person standing under an open black umbrella. Can anyone come up with a non-sinister explanation for this?" Writing in the New Yorker's Talk of the Town series in December 1967, writer John Updike suggested the mystery surrounding who the Umbrella Man was and what he was doing on the grassy knoll dangles around history's neck like a fetish. None of the authorities, the Dallas Police, the Secret Service, the FBI, or even the Warren Commission, ever located or identified him or could explain his baffling appearance. Given all the mystery surrounding the assassination, it was only natural to concoct all sorts of ominous motives animating the sinister character and his menacing umbrella. Who was the Umbrella Man, and what was he doing? Clearly, he played a role in the conspiracy to kill the president. Perhaps the Umbrella Man had a gun. The umbrella was a gun device of some sort, firing a flechette into the president's throat. Or maybe it was a way to signal to the actual shooter to go ahead with the assassination. Into this vacuum of uncertainty, it did not seem unreasonable to make a causal link between the shadowy figure, his umbrella, and the fateful events of that day. Or not. In 1978, Louis Stephen Witt reluctantly came forward to the House Select Committee on Assassinations to admit that he was the Umbrella Man and to explain himself. In 1963, Witt worked near the Dealey Plaza and took a walk every day during his lunch hour. Quote, "I was going to use this umbrella to heckle the president's motorcade. Being a conservative type fellow, I sort of placed him in the liberal camp, and I was just going to do a little bit of heckling." The umbrella was a symbolic protest. Quote, "It had something to do with when the senior Mr. Kennedy was ambassador to England and the prime minister and some activity they had in appeasing Hitler. The Umbrella Man that the prime minister of England came back with, it kind of got to be a symbol of some manner with the British people. By association, it got transferred to the Kennedy family, and as I understood it, it was a sore spot with the Kennedy family." When asked if his protest had anything to do with JFK's overall, say, policy towards the Russians, Witt replied, no, it wasn't that at all." As Thompson points out, this explanation was, quote, "just wacky enough to be true." It was a stark reminder to anyone looking at the past. Quote, "If you have any fact which you can point at that you think is really sinister, is really obviously a fact that you can point to where there's some sinister underpinning, hey, forget it, man, because you can never on your own think of all the non-sinister, perfectly valid explanations for that fact." A cautionary tale. Talking about the film, Morris argued his interest in the assassination emerged from his curiosity about the nature of historical investigation and how to assess evidence. Quote, "Why, after 48 years, are people still quarreling and quibbling about this case? What is it about this case that has led not to a solution, but to an endless proliferation of possible solutions. Thompson, summarizing Updike, says that historical research may have two parts. First, the macro level, where things obey natural laws and usual things happen and unusual things don't happen. And the world under a microscope, where you'll find a whole dimension of weird, incredible things going on. My talk today is about thinking historically. It is not a history of a particular event, person, place, or process, nor is it strictly a presentation about methodology or how to do historical work effectively. There are many excellent books and articles that can help you become a good historian. What I hope to do instead is to explore something called a historical sensibility, a familiarity with the past and its powerful and often unpredictable rhythms, which I believe can be a powerful tool to understand and aid in the making of policy, especially foreign economic, and national security policy. Now, this may strike some people as odd or problematic. First, there are many who just assume that the main role of a historian is to unearth, collect, and present facts. These facts are then strung together to create a linear narrative with a clear beginning, middle, and end. For many in the quote unquote harder social sciences, however, this is often seen as little more than storytelling. For true knowledge to appear, many facts have to be collected, shaved down to look alike, then aggregated and analyzed to discover generalizable laws of the universe. To be sure, historians are dogged pursuers of evidence and will travel all over the world to find a document or conduct an interview that might help shed light on the past. They all can construct stories to help us understand worlds gone by. But it is important to remember, the facts do not speak for themselves, and the linear surface narrative that so appeals to our brains is often misleading. Immersing oneself in the past sensitizes you to how unusual, unexpected, and non-linear history can be. Historians traffic in ironies, unintended consequences, and are often the ambulance chasers of surprise. We live in that gap Thompson identifies between a world structured by discoverable laws and the dimension where weird, incredible things are happening. We try to make sense of both and bring these worlds together. We try to understand and explain the origins and consequences of seismic events like assassinations of presidents, while trying to understand if that man with the black umbrella should worry us at all. Now, what do I mean when I use the term historical sensibility, and how might it be helpful for strategy and statecraft? A historical sensibility is a familiarity with the past and its powerful and often unpredictable rhythms. It is less a method than a practice, a mental awareness, a discernment, a responsiveness to the past and how it unfolds into our own present world. Developing this sensibility can provide many benefits and insights into the world that decision makers face, a world of complexity and radical uncertainty, and can also provide a certain humility and a prudence when thinking about decision making. The scholar has termed it the historical mind, which he aptly describes as, quote, a way of thinking shaped by one's reading of history and by using history as a mode of inquiry and a framework for thinking about problems. Now, what are the qualities of this orientation and how can one obtain it? Historical sensibility includes several characteristics. First, the sensibility demonstrates a toleration, even an appreciation of uncertainty, of surprise, and of unintended consequences in human affairs, and a comfort with indeterminacy and multi-causal explanations. It makes the familiar unfamiliar, while revealing the unfamiliar in what was believed to be well understood. Furthermore, historical sensibility provides an empathy, but not necessarily a sympathy for the past, a willingness to understand historical subjects on their own terms and as products of a particular place and time. This also means developing a consciousness of the powerful hold that history exerts on other cultures, other leaders, and nations. It acknowledges the fundamental importance of the perspective of the observer. Though the historian often strives for an elusive objectivity, She admits that the who, what, and when of the historian matters quite a bit when reconstructing the past. Finally, a historical sensibility recognizes and appreciates complexity, and though willing to be proven wrong, cast a skeptical eye on claims of parsimonious models that claim to explain, generalize, and predict complex social, cultural, and political behavior. As Gordon Wood eloquently stated, quote, "To possess a historical sense does not mean simply to possess information about the past. It means to have a different consciousness, a historical consciousness, to have incorporated into our minds a mode of understanding that profoundly influences the way that we look at the world." Or to quote the historian and policymaker Phil Zelikow, "The path of complexity is difficult, but the rewards include more lifelike fitness for the intellect. And seen through a historian's microscope, the world can seem far stranger and more fascinating than anything that could be seen by the unaided eye." The best historical work and the adept historical sensibility combines and integrates these insights and methods to develop both a better understanding of the past and what it can tell us and not tell us about the choices and circumstances we face today. Now, how is this achieved? In my longer work, I've identified lists of tools, lessons, and advantages a historical approach might provide to the policymaker. I won't go through them all today. Some are obvious, like understanding vertical history, which is assessing the temporal or short, medium, and long-term causes of an event and how they interact, or identifying what I've called horizontal history, which looks at the spatial dimension of history, or how different issues are interconnected and related at the same time. Another tool of the historical sensibility is to be aware of and sensitive to unintended consequences of actions. I'll provide an example. When President Dwight Eisenhower approved financing a massive dam in Afghanistan in the 1950s, what he hoped to achieve was to improve the agricultural productivity in a developing nation, not to make possible the creation of one of the world's largest opium crops. A less obvious lesson from this sensibility is that history teaches decision makers about something I call chronological proportionality, or the weight of historical events. What does this mean? The issues that grab our attention today and dominate the headlines of newspapers that we all read are often not the questions that have the most important long-term consequences. In 1967 and 1968, for example, American newspapers had far more print on the war in Vietnam than they had on the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the Six-Day War in the Middle East, or the political changes in China and Eastern Europe. But which of those events mattered more to the long-term US and global interests from our current perspective? Let me give you my favorite example. Consider the historian Erez Manella's path-breaking work on smallpox eradication. During the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union, bitter geopolitical and ideological rivals, worked together on global efforts to eradicate this disease. This was an extraordinarily important accomplishment. In 1965, 2 million people died of smallpox. Up till 1965, over 300 million people had died of smallpox, twice the number of people that had died in all the wars combined. Due to this cooperation, which has rarely been recognized, smallpox went from killing 2 million people a year to 10 years later, killing absolutely none. Manella demonstrates how a combination of factors and actors came together far below the levels of high policy, but still with the result of discrete decisions to generate policy outcomes that had profound global consequences that few recognized at the time, and you would be hard-pressed to find on the front page of the New York Times. What this suggests is that it's not always clear in real time what matters most, though a historical sensibility can sensitize us to look for real-world consequences in unusual places. Think about recent politics. 30 or 40 years from now, will we be talking about the sort of push and pull of bitter political polarization in the Trump administration? Or will there be some deeper tectonic shift, perhaps around the climate, demographics, or technology, or some completely unexpected event like what we're going through right now that no one at all foreseen, which shapes the realities of a future world? We never fully know while it's happening, but historical sensibility sensitizes us to the possibility that what really matters is happening in more secret places, in less obvious ways. Related to this, history conditions decision makers to understand that the policy decisions made in world capitals are sometimes far less important in shaping what matters in the world than other, often less visible historical forces. Culture, technology, demographics, and geography, for example, are all critical forces that are less pliable to policy than we often think. Let me give you an example. In the middle of the 1970s, three events took place within a very short period of time, all within California. They were the sale of the Apple personal computer, the release of Star Wars, one of the highest growing motion pictures of all time, and the famous 1976 Judgment of Paris wine test, where previously unknown wines from Napa Valley bested established French wines in a blind taste test. In other words, policymakers in Washington in the mid-1970s, poring over economic data, looking at crime statistics and urban crisis, witnessing political chaos abroad, and fearing a rising Soviet military behemoth that appeared to be winning the arms race, had very little reason to be optimistic about America's future. But the future was being made elsewhere, not in Washington, D.C., not in the White House, and not in Congress. It was being made in ways that was different than how policymakers understood in places like California, where deep and often obscure historical forces were working to transform the United States economy, society, technological base, and culture in ways that would have a profound effect on American power and world history in the decades that followed. A deep historical perspective should also allow decision makers to avoid falling into outcome or retrospective bias, or the trap of what I call misunderstanding the Third Balkan War. As National Security Advisor Sandy Berger once pointed out, history is written through a rear view mirror, but unfolds through a foggy windshield. If the past is to be of use to policymakers, it must be exploited and understood in a way that avoids what economists call the curse of knowledge, or that cognitive bias that we all have that emerges only in hindsight, where the outcome of a historical event was more predictable or appeared more predictable than was likely the case. Since we know how past events turned out, we often easily assume that the causal path that led to the event was inevitable. Of course, this isn't the case at all. The most complex and difficult policy choices often involve what former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has called 51-49 decisions. In other words, it's difficult, almost impossible to know a priori whether difficult policy choices will turn out well and correctly, even if in retrospect it turns out to be obvious. Many times, bad outcomes result from ideal processes, and occasionally good results emerge from terrible processes and low probability efforts. This is true for good policies as well as bad, which an immersion in history and living through the eyes of the past should tell us. This points to why we should be careful not to cherry pick events from the past or be unaware of horizontal connections, as I mentioned above. Consider the following. During what the historian Fred Logevall has called the long 1964, the Johnson administration made what was, in retrospect, tragic and unwise decisions to escalate the United States' role in the war in Southeast Asia. Looked at both in hindsight and at the time, we know the outcome, and in isolation from anything else, just focusing on American policy in Southeast Asia, the policy, which was disastrous, makes Johnson and his advisors look incompetent and inept. Consider something that was going on at the same time. At the very same time, the same administration carried out an impressive debate and discussion on how to respond to what was seen as a far greater long-term danger, the People's Republics of China's detonation of an atomic device in October of 1964. This process, this debate and discussion, led to a successful and sophisticated nuclear nonproliferation policy that resulted first in the 1968 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and established the principles that guide and shape US nuclear nonproliferation policy to this day. This policy, which has been one of the most successful policies in US foreign policy, has kept the number of nuclear powers in the single digits, prevented nuclear weapons from being used, and reduced the overall stockpiles of nuclear weapons in the world, an outcome people in 1964 would have found miraculous. This raises a question. Did the same people who crafted those complex strategies simply lose 20 IQ points when the discussion turned to Vietnam? It was the same people at the same time having a meeting several hours later. In fact, what this story tells us is that making policy in real time is extraordinarily difficult, and history should avoid the simplistic judgments based solely on future outcomes that could not be anticipated. Finally, a historical sensibility conditions the observer to recognize perspective. We know that it is important to understand how others view and understand the past, to view the world from the shoes of other peoples and cultures. There's also a temporal aspect to this perspective. Let me give you an example, or rather a puzzle. Imagine you're the leader of a country and you possess the world's 8th or 9th largest economy, but you're politically dominated by an aggressive military and surrounded by seemingly insurmountable security challenges, enemies all around you. Now, let's say I offer you this deal, that if you follow the grand strategy I suggest, in a very short period of time, from a historical perspective, you will become the world's 2nd largest economy, built on a thriving technological base. Your security will be taken care of and you'll be relatively secure, and you'll develop a healthy democracy and a civic culture that was largely pacifistic. Sounds like a pretty good deal, right? And must have been based on a brilliant grand strategy. But who does it describe? A nation, Japan in 1940, compared to Japan in 1970. And Japan in 1940 pursued one of the most disastrous, incomprehensibly incompetent grand strategies in history. Yet in 1970, had become one of the most admired countries in the world. This shows you what a historical sensibility provides, that sense of irony and unintended consequences that are often missing from our linear analyses of how the world works. Or imagine this exercise. Let's say a publisher provides a scholar with 300 pages to write on the history of the world between 1945 and 1990. Even though the subject and the end date of the book would remain the same, the publisher also tells the author that he expects her to update this volume as time goes on. First revision might be in 2000, then in 2020, then in 2045. But still, the book would be the same length as it was in 1990. What would the author do with those 300 pages as time went on? History reveals that how you assess the past, it does not only involve who is involved, but when the question is asked. The book published in 1990, the 300 pages might have 3 or 4 pages on China. By 2020, it might have 50 or 60 pages on China. The pages on written in 1990 might have very little on climate change, but by 2045, the book might be dominated by climate change. And it's not that history between 1945 and 1990 changed, or even necessarily that we learned new things about it. What we care about from the past is shaped and changes based on our contemporary interests. Perspective also encourages the policymaker to challenge their core assumptions and to constantly revise and update their understanding of the past. This is important because many of the things we often believe about the past are often untrue. Let me give you another example. How many of you think you know the story of the famous baseball player, Ty Cobb? If I were to ask you, good guy or bad guy, what would you say? Baseball fans generally recognize Cobb as the greatest hitter who ever lived, but they also grew up with stories of his mean-spiritedness, cheating, violence, racism, and just generally seen as a bad person who was hated by his fellow players. This image of Ty Cobb, great player, bad man, was repeated in various forms over the years, both in books, popular culture, and in film, and treated as gospel truth until the historian and author Charles Learham started researching a biography and soon recognized that the received wisdom was completely wrong. It turns out that Cobb was an avid student of history, descended from a long line of abolitionists who enjoyed acting on the stage. While he was a passionate and aggressive ball player, Cobb was well respected and, it turns out, liked by his contemporaries, and demonstrated a racial sensitivity that was unusual for the age. Learson highlights why the myth of the terrible Cobb emerged. An unscrupulous biographer, Al Stump, simply made up sensational stories to sell books, and the stories persisted for decades. As Learson says, it's easy to understand why the prevailing view continued. People have been told that Cobb was a bad man over and over all their lives. Repetition felt like evidence. Thinking historically is one of those tools that we can use to help prevent us from these kind of mistakes. To conclude, the benefits of history to policy and to strategy and statecraft are not always obvious. As a discipline, history sits awkwardly but proudly between the humanities and the social sciences. History provides few off-the-shelf lessons, makes no predictions, and resists easy generalizations. It is often better at demonstrating what an event or phenomena is not than identifying what it is. And of course, the past is as likely to be misused as to provide lessons. Untamed, history can be a dangerous and mercurial lover who will always tell you what you want to hear. History also resists efforts to become applied. Compared to its other, more muscular cousins in the social sciences, history can at times look anemic. As Gordon Wood points out, quote, unlike sociology, political science, psychology, and other social sciences, which tend to breed confidence in managing the future, history tends to inculcate skepticism about our abilities to manipulate and control purposefully our destiny. And let's face it, historians are also strange people. I, being one, will confess to this, very different from policymakers. At times, they're intellectually chaste, while at other times wildly intellectually promiscuous. Chaste in their obsession to uncover every last shred of evidence, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Promiscuous in their ability to create whole worlds and civilizations on the written page, largely from their imaginations. What other avocation could obsessively fight over the precise timing of a telegram sent between two political leaders on the eve of war in 1914, but boldly and out of thin air name and define whole historical periods? It's easy to forget, but such categories such as the Middle Ages or the Renaissance of the modern world do not exist in nature. They are instead the creative result of the historian's imagination. The very concept, for example, the French Revolution, was not solidified until established by historians almost a half century after the event. Bringing this world of history together with the immediacy of the world of policy is not easy or natural. And unfortunately, historical knowledge is no guarantee of success. The double first earned by Sir Anthony Eden while he was at Oxford in Persian and Arabic did not prevent him from pursuing disastrous policies towards Iran and Egypt when he was Prime Minister of Great Britain during the early and mid-1950s. However, history can offer lessons, insights, and even methods, and though they are often meager and must be used cautiously and with care. The most important quality of a historical sensibility, I would suggest, is a valuable gift that the immersion in the past provides us. It's humility. From the world of social science, where bold predictions and generalizations are the realm of the coin, and from the universe of policymakers, where difficult choices demand clear answers and decisions can have enormous consequences, this may not seem like very much, but perhaps that is the point. Making difficult decisions, facing complexity, and the radical uncertainty of the future is very, very hard, and the consequences can be enormous. Even the best ideas will only help so much, though given the stakes, even those marginal improvements are well worth seeking. Perhaps it's helpful to remember the words of Sir Michael Howard, who offered the best argument for historical sensibility. The true use of history, whether civil or military, is not to make a man clever for the next time. It is to make him wise forever. Thank you. I look forward to your questions. Let's see what we have. Okay, from Deirdre. Would a curation of individual global forecasting outcomes play a role in historical sensibility and essentially strategy? This is actually a really interesting question, and I think an important one. One of the interesting things about historical thinking is that it makes no claims to predict the future. And in fact, it often dismisses efforts to predict the future. On the other hand, we understandably and naturally want to have a sense of what is going on. And your use of the word forecasting made me think of a process that's often used in the intelligence community and the private sector called scenario planning. Scenario planning is very interesting because what it attempts to do is not to predict the exact pinpoint future, but to identify underlying forces, tectonic forces that are at work in the world, and to use them to imagine possible futures. And what I've always found so interesting about this methodology is that it looks similar to the way historians think. Meaning that it looks at the unfolding of events as often a nonlinear process. It looks at surprises. It looks at unintended consequences. So I think that, and by the way, this is one of these things that you see when you talk to people in the intelligence community. If you spend any time with people, say in the CIA, many of whom have a deep love of history, and are deeply immersed in an understanding of the past, they're caught in this terrible position. Their understanding of history makes it clear that predictions are very, very hard, and being in the knowledge of the past makes you realize it's impossible. Yet, part of their job is to anticipate the future. And I think one of the things we as historians probably need to do a better job at is explaining why this historical sensibility and thinking historically could provide tools to anticipate the future, to be sensitive to underlying deeper forces that might be at work that will shape what we face, while removing the powerful cultural and political incentives to get people to make point predictions about the future, which, given the complexity and uncertainty of events, is not only impossible, but probably a bad business to be in. So I hope that helps explain that question. So from Fritz, what example of books that reflect a solid historical sensibility? How about ones that show little historical sensibility? So there's a lot of really fun books to read to get a sense for this. I mentioned Gordon Wood, who's a wonderful historian of the early American Republic, who has has written a variety of essays. Bernard Balin, who was his mentor, has also written a similar book like this. I guess I would give three answers to this question. The first is just a general immersion in history. Historians are funny. They don't like talking about what they do. Unlike, say, economists or sociologists or engineers, where, for understandable reasons, there's much discussion of method. And there's also lots of debate and discussion about agreeing upon a method. Historians take a more Catholic approach to this. Generally, there's many different ways of looking at the past. There's different questions that you can ask. There's different historical forces you can focus on. So the first thing I would say is a deep immersion in lots of different historical works is a good idea. And read widely in history. Read our great historians. Our Johns Hopkins History Department is one of the best history departments in the country. Read the books produced by the authors in their department. But then the second thing I would say is occasionally there are books that do reflect upon what it means to think historically. Eliot Cohen has a very nice essay on this, on the historical mind, that is worth checking out. E.H. Carr has a terrific book called What is History, which were a series of lectures he gave about his reflections about the historical profession. Margaret Macmillan has a nice little book that's similar about how history can be used and misused. John Lewis Gaddis has a book called The Landscape of History, which spends a lot of time especially explaining to political scientists what it is history does and what history doesn't do. This is a tricky question about the ones that demonstrate little historical sensibility. And I want to be careful here because I think that I just spent some time actually over the weekend writing about the great strategist Thomas Schelling. And Thomas Schelling was an economist. He was a game theorist. And he more or less brilliantly developed the intellectual architecture for modern arms control. But many of his theories were also used to help inform and shape some of the less wise policies of the Johnson administration during the bombing in North Vietnam. And as I reflected upon it and looked closer at his work, it struck me that Schelling, for all of his brilliance, had a very poor understanding of the past and very little of that historical sensibility. None of the humility that comes with wrestling with history, and an overconfident belief that through sheer intellectual willpower and models and social science game theory, he could construct models that would help explain how the world worked and predict outcomes. And some of his contributions were extraordinary. His work on strategic stability and arms control were transformative, but his work on coercion and signaling, which had a very big influence on the Johnson administration's bombing in North Vietnam, were just terrible ideas. And so I don't want to pick on Thomas Schelling, nor necessarily on economists. There are many great economic historians, but I do think that there are some traditions in certain disciplines that could do with some more historical sensibility. Okay, let's see. Oh, this is a good one from Martha. Let me just get this up about uncertainty. In describing historical sensibility, you mentioned the idea of uncertainty. What can historians teach us about the value of uncertainty, particularly in moments of crisis? This is a fantastic question, and it's one I've been thinking about, and I'm sure we've all been thinking about in the middle of this crisis. And I think it's a reminder to something that we forget. Making policy, human political, social, and cultural interactions are often far too complex to be modeled. And one of the reasons I mentioned earlier in the talk about how often social science understandably tries to take from history events and phenomena, shave them down and make them look alike, um, accumulate them, aggregate them, uh, and look for trends and look for uh, correlations and also causal correlations so that they could then make predictions about the future. And there are many, many parts of human behavior where this makes sense. But there are also many, many parts, particularly of political and strategy and statecraft behavior, where this method is perhaps less well suited. And I think that I mentioned the Kissinger quote earlier. President Johnson used to say, by the time a decision got to his desk, what it meant was lots of really, really smart people uh, in the government had been unable to make a decision and had been able to say what was right or wrong. And so it fell on his desk. And basically, what that meant was people didn't know what the decision would do to shape the future. And that condition of radical uncertainty, which in a certain extent we all know, history reminds us of it. We all, understandably, our brains are wired to think in narratives where we've ended up where we are for a reason, and that the path made sense, and that there was a certain determinacy to it. But one of the things that when you do really good historical work, particularly when you focus on decisions and choices, particularly those 51-49 ones, you realize that if you had chosen alternatives, if you had chosen different policies, you could live in a different world. One of the Cold War examples I love to think about is George Kennan, of course, was the father of containment in his famous X article in Foreign Affairs and his long telegram. And he was head of policy planning. What is less well known is as time went on, he became less convinced that what the US policy, particularly in NATO, was correct. And one of the things that he advocated was instead of building up NATO and reintegrating West Germany into a military alliance, which was very controversial and uncertain at the time, what he proposed was instead going to the Soviet Union and offering, you pull your troops out of Eastern Europe, we pull our troops out of Western Europe, we let Germany reunify, but it's neutral. Now, that policy was ultimately rejected. My take is that that is a good thing it was rejected. But imagine what the Cold War in the world might have looked like if, with a United States that had left Europe, a Germany that was unified but neutral, with the Soviet Union nearby. Would it have been better? Would it have been worse? Would it have been more dangerous? We don't know. We just know it would have been much, much, much different, right? And so something like the Cold War, which we think unfolded according to an inevitable path, actually there was a ton of contingency involved. And I think we should always bear in mind that people making decisions face radical uncertainty about the future. And we're in a situation right now where that radical uncertainty is more present than I think any time in our lives. We don't know, we know so little about how the virus works. We know so little about what its future is. We know so little about what policies are most effective. We know so little about the trade-offs between the efforts that we make to mitigate the crisis and the second and third order consequences. So I think uncertainty is one of the most important principles that I think historical sensibility teaches you. From Dave, is it still worth reading Thinking in Time, The Uses of History for Decision Makers by Richard Neustadt and Ernie May? Another great question. So May and Neustadt were interesting characters. Dick Neustadt was a political scientist who had been a presidential advisor. As a young man, he had actually helped President Truman, and then he worked with President Kennedy and even President Johnson, and ended up being a crucial player in helping to create the Kennedy School for Public Affairs at Harvard, which is a fascinating story. Ernie May had been a young diplomatic historian who began in the late 50s and early 60s, who was a historian of American foreign relations. Early on in their career at the Kennedy School, Neustadt had migrated from the political science department, May from the history department, and they created, and Thomas Schelling was there, they created a school where different disciplines could gather in order to share their knowledge about solving problems. Paul Doty, a biochemist, was there. Al Carnicels, a nuclear engineer. It was truly an interdisciplinary place. And May and Neustadt created a course for the uses of history to help policymakers. Now, full disclosure, Hal Brands and I teach a course on grand strategy. And thinking historically, which is very inspired by this tremendous class. They created a book out of it called Thinking in Time. It's a very useful book in some ways. In some ways, it's less useful. One of the interesting stories about May and Neustadt, and Graham Allison is involved in this, and George Bundy, this class that they taught at the Kennedy School, and the academics and scholars that gathered at the Kennedy School in the late 60s and early and mid 70s were very influenced by a way of understanding policy that came to be called bureaucratic politics. And one has to reimagine what it was like to return to the university world, particularly Harvard in the late 60s and the mid 1970s through the 80s. These were some of the best and the brightest who had helped create and shape the policies of the Kennedy and Johnson administration. They thought they had saved the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They created the new frontier. They thought they were brilliant. And then the disaster of Vietnam happens. And I have a hypothesis. It's a little bit controversial, but a lot of these people come back to Harvard and Cambridge in the late 60s and early 70s to lick their wounds. And they want an explanation for why did Vietnam happen. Well, they didn't want to blame themselves and their ideas, nor did they want to blame their heroes, President Johnson, President Kennedy. So they blamed the malevolent forces of the faceless bureaucracy. And this is where the School of Bureaucratic Politics became very popular. And if you read Thinking in Time, much of it is really, there's this shadow of bureaucratic politics as an explanation for less than ideal outcomes. You actually see this influence in a lot of people associated with the who were trained by Neustadt and May. May was an extraordinary historian, trained a lot of people. May had a role, and his protege Phil Zelikow wrote the 9/11 Commission report. You can see a bit of this bureaucratic politics flavor in that as well. And so I would not deny that bureaucratic politics is a powerful and important explanation for outcomes. No one can be in a university and not recognize how important bureaucratic politics are. But when I was in Austin working at the LBJ school and was next to the LBJ Presidential Library, I was there when many of the presidential tapes were released. And you spend some time listening to President Johnson, and you realize very quickly that it was not bureaucrats telling Johnson what to do. On the issues he cared about, like Vietnam, Johnson was driving things. Johnson was the one making the decisions. The tapes make that very clear. So this is kind of a long-winded way of saying it's an important book. I like May's Lessons of the Past better. It was published in 1975. It's a very thoughtful sort of set of reflections on the use of history. So that would be my recommendation. Okay. From Stephen, just pull this question up. In a time when so much history is made up by autocratic leaders, how do we make thinking historically a common practice? Do newspaper column inches need to be reserved for historical analysis? Now, these are great questions. So I have long had a hypothesis. This is probably a decent audience to try it out on. We have a lot of measures that we use for what we might call healthy civic society. Democracy, transparency, free press. One of the things that I think is often important but not represented in these kind of measures is whether or not a society has a healthy appreciation for historical revisionism. Meaning, does the society support it when historians say things that make people uncomfortable? There's always been a danger, and this is a clear danger of history and policy, of policymakers and historians being too close together. Historians correctly guard their intellectual independence and are concerned if they are too close and engaged with the making of power, they can become corrupt. On the subject of Harvard and the Kennedy administration, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. is an interesting example. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was a very important historian, wrote an award-winning book on the age of Jackson, more or less, which is an interesting and important book now that people are making comparisons between Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson. And Jackson was, or Schlesinger, excuse me, was considered a very important historian of American politics. He fell in with the New Frontier crowd, the Walt Rossell, John Kenneth Galbraith, McGeorge Bundy, Harvard crowd that went down to Washington, and became sort of a court historian. And I think if you were to read his two books that he wrote about the Kennedy administration, one about Bobby and one about more or less about uh, you know, his brother John, you would realize that he had lost his objectivity to the extent that historians can be objective. So historians are constantly aware that there are all sorts of entities out there, particularly political entities, that want to use the past for their own purposes. This is particularly true in autocracies where there is a sort of state mandated form of history. And history is one of those things that it can be misused as well as used. John Dower, who's a terrific historian of Japan and wrote a great book about War Without Mercy and some great books and scholarship about the American occupation of Japan after World War II. He used to talk about how horrified he was that the Bush administration would use his book as an explanation and a justification for why they thought the occupation of Iraq would go well. And he would complain continually, stop using my example of Japan, stop using my scholarship. And he couldn't make them stop, even though he felt, and I think he was right about this, they misapplied the lessons. So Stephen, it's a really good question. I think honest, open, revisionist history is an absolutely essential part of the lifeblood of a thriving democracy. And I would note there are some democracies that have less revisionism. And there are some countries that are particularly good on the revisionist side and allowing this. You want to have historians that tell, that aren't simply producing what I like to call historical comfort food that make people feel good or patriotic, but actually causes them to think and challenges their leaders. Now, how that we inculcate this practice, I think we as historians need to do a better job of explaining why it is what we do is so important. It's important not just because an understanding of the past is important, but because this way of thinking, which is different than a legal way of thinking, an engineering way of understanding the world, a philosophical way of understanding the world, is a mode of thinking, a way of analysis that provides powerful insights into understanding a complex world. And when used well, I believe can help make for better decision making. Historians have been uncomfortable making this argument for reasons that I understand. There have been efforts to do it. We're doing it at the Kissinger Center. Harvard Business School for years has hired historians in their business and international governance program under people like Tom McCraw. but we need to do a better job. Okay, from William. What do you think of the generally atrophying state of history departments in our universities today? What will be the consequences of the future of higher education in history in the curriculum? So I would say on this that I have had, do some light Googling of my name to find out my views on this, and they're not always welcome either outside of history departments or within history departments. But what I will say is I passionately believe in the importance of history, the study of history, the teaching of history. I think the American discipline of history certainly has questions to answer about how they've organized the discipline. Higher education and universities organize knowledge in interesting ways. Of course, that all began at Johns Hopkins in the 1870s, and the modern discipline of American history really began at Johns Hopkins. And I think that for a variety of reasons, sometimes because on the demand side, people in the outside world say, well, why should I care about the past? We're in a world of new technology and exciting new futures. What can the past show us? And we need to remind people the importance of the past. But I think there's also a supply issue. I think that there's no doubt that history departments have seen dramatically declining enrollments. Some of that has to do with market forces, but some of it has to do with we need to do a better job of explaining why history is not just exciting, why it's not just engaging, but it's a critical tool to help you become a better thinker, a better citizen, a more successful decision maker. From Carolyn, in order to effectively work with youth around the world right now, how would you describe the way in which youth populations fit into a historical sensibility? I think one of the great things about history is that it plays into what I think young people recognize, and that is a common humanity. We often like to think about history as explaining our differences, differences that arise over time, differences that arise over culture, differences that arise over status or profession or whatever the classifications that we use. And history does do that. History does explain the origins and consequences of those divisions. But I think one of the best things that history does, particularly for young people, is to highlight them towards a common humanity, a common human story. And let's face it, I think one of the things that the COVID crisis is highlighting for us is that our more traditional ways of understanding history through, say, a national lens aren't necessarily the most effective right now. The fact is that, and there's been a lot of really good global history and transnational history and international history. Pandemics are not new. William McNeill wrote an extraordinary book called Plagues and People. And I actually think this is one of the interesting issues where historical sensibility is important. I mentioned the smallpox story. Until about 75 years ago, epidemics, pandemics, disease were a normal part of life. Whether it was the 1918-19 flu, whether it was polio, whether it was smallpox, whether it was cholera, whether it was yellow fever, whether it was malaria, disease, pandemics, epidemics were a natural part of life. I was just actually reading a terrific piece about in the 19th century as international trade and globalization increased, how the world community, particularly the Europeans, tried to come together to come up with common global public health standards and how to deal with quarantine policies. I think this current crisis is a reminder that we're all sort of on the same globe and that we share a common humanity. And I think that would be the best way to sort of generate that historical sensibility. I think we have time for one more questions. Roberto, your introduction brought me back to authors such as Howard and Prey. However, I'd like to hear your comments also on the nexus between cultural understandings and historical sensibility in statecraft. Another great question. I'm working on a book on the 70s. And one of my arguments about the 70s is not just about technology changing, not just about um, the Silicon Valley story. It's actually about how our conception of what it meant to be a human being in terms of human freedom and autonomy and being able to shape our destiny. And how, even though it's often observed only in the breach, the whole concept of tolerance emerges, and how the sort of way we think of what it is to be human begins or shows a lot of its origins in this California story of the 1970s, whether it's the rise of the gay rights movement, whether it's Muscle Beach and Arnold Schwarzenegger and working out in gyms, whether it's comedy in Los Angeles, that much of how we identify who we are today, which is a cultural phenomena, emerges from a certain time and a place. Obviously, California in the 1970s is not the only place of it, but so much of the world we live in today emerged at a time when people thought the United States was going through a socioeconomic malaise and cultural decay and political decline, when in fact, the notion of who we are as human beings, the ones that people in the millennial generation and below understand implicitly, really emerged during that time. So, and this is something that policymakers could benefit from learning, because those cultural sources are extraordinarily important. Well, I think that's all that I have time for today. I want to thank you all for joining me. And if this interested you, I wanted to let you know that I will be giving another presentation on the past and the future of world order, which will be taking place on May 21st at 7 p.m. So if you enjoyed this, I hope you'll join me all then as well. Thank you.